Hello, welcome to our presentation on decarbonising Australia's national electricity market using firm low-carbon technologies. I'm Dominic Davis and my colleague for this work is Professor Michael Breer, and we're from the University of Melbourne. Australia's national electricity market, the NEM, is a wholesale electricity market that operates on one of the world's longest interconnected power systems. It extends approximately 5,000 kilometres from North Queensland down Australia's east coast around to South Australia and across to Tasmania. The NEM delivers approximately 200 terawatt hours of electricity to consumers each year, with a peak demand of about 35 gigawatts in summer. It is operated by Australia's ISO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO. And each year, AEMO issues a long-term planning study called the Integrated System Plan, or ISP. ISPs have recently found that variable renewable generation, backed by storage and at times gas plant, form the most prospective least cost decarbonisation routes, as Australia's large coal-fired fleet is retired. Australia has strong wind and solar resource and low population density, so continued cost reductions mean that renewables will play a growing role in the system. However, the prospects of several other low-carbon technologies have not been assessed in most long-term planning studies, particularly for more innovative combinations of biofuels, carbon capture and storage, either new or retrofit to existing plants, and new nuclear technologies, and for markets with negative total emissions that offset emissions in other parts of the economy. There is also significant value in identifying pathways that might result, given the manifold uncertainties in any long-term planning problem. So this work assesses such options using the ISP and other authoritative input assumptions and transparent methods. So we do this by modelling the NEM with an optimisation model, the objective of which is to minimise the discounted total costs of the required new build generation, storage and transmission infrastructure, such that demand is met in the 5 regions of the NEM over the planning period. This optimisation is subject to linearly decreasing annual emissions trajectories from 2020 to some emissions abatement target in 2050 or some other year. This modelling is consistent with the latest ISP and includes existing generators and a range of new candidate generation technologies, hourly demand in each NEM region, geographically representative intermittency of wind and solar plant, utility scale energy storage, shutdown of all generators no later than their maximum operating life, annual constraints on hydropower and biofuel availability, linearised plant dynamics, and a 5.9% real discount rate. Now, a key aspect of our modelling is that we allow all coal and combined cycle gas turbine plant to be retrofit with carbon capture and storage at any time. And we also allow those plants to be co-fired with biomass and methane respectively. The potential benefit of retrofitting CCS is that the CCS costs can then be discounted and implemented when required to achieve an abatement target, and thereby reducing the total costs. Biofuels with CCS then enable net negative emissions from a given plant. So, allowing biomass substitution into coal plant and biomethane substitution into gas plant achieves emissions reductions by fuel substitution. For example, the biomethane production and use in a gas plant with CCS involves multiple transfers of greenhouse gases to and from the environment, as shown in this diagram. The emissions reduction potential of biofuel substitution for fossil fuels is on the basis that biogenic emissions released during biofuel combustion are offset by CO2 that's recaptured in new growth. The use of a CCS facility then, to capture some of these biogenic combustion emissions, would then result in a net negative flow of emissions to the environment. Now, the biofuel cost, resource availability, and associated emissions input data to this modelling are based on literature review. Here we have just shown the process for biogas, but the process for biomass is similar. For this modelling, the national biogas feedstock availability is estimated at 48 petajoules per year, which is approximately 5 terawatt hours of electricity at a 40% conversion efficiency. This resource is based on estimates of urban waste, livestock residues, and food processing residues, which are wet waste streams that are suitable for biogas production with anaerobic digestion. The cost of biofuels is highly variable and influenced by the collection and transport requirements of a given feedstock. In this work, we estimate the average cost of biogas production and upgrading to be $14 per gigajoule of biomethane. Now, this biogas resource of 48 petajoules per year is relatively small, but what's interesting about the use of biogas is the opportunity of avoiding emissions in the agriculture sector. Firstly, the use of bio-waste feedstocks for biomethane production can avoid manure and bio-waste handling that would normally result in methane formation. And secondly, digestate, which is the solid byproduct of anaerobic digestion, can be used to replace fossil-based fertilizers and therefore avoid the associated emissions with fertilizer production. Accounting for these avoided processes can total up to negative 300 kilograms of CO2 per gigajoule of biomethane, depending on the feedstock and the pathway, as has been certified by the California Air Resources Board with the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. In this presentation, we assume this best case life cycle emissions scenario, but our work that's not shown here assesses the sensitivity of results to this value. So here we present the results of our reference case, in which there is no constraint on emissions and no technical constraint on variable renewables. That is, there is no limit to the amount of renewable capacity that can be accommodated in the system. Here we see that the aging coal fleet is replaced by wind, utility solar PV, and pumped hydro energy storage. So that in this case, by 2050, emissions have reduced to around 10 megatons per year, corresponding to a 94% reduction of emissions relative to 2005 levels. This is a remarkable result, given there is no constraint on the emissions applied here. But if we now consider the results with emissions constraints of linear trajectories to various emissions abatement targets and the cost of this transition, we can see that 100% abatement by 2050 is about 5% more expensive than having no emissions constraint. And similarly, 100% emissions abatement by 2040 is also about 5% more expensive than the same emissions constraint by 2050. Now, the cases of 80 to 90% emissions abatement by 2050, they force earlier decarbonisation than having no constraint. And so they have slightly higher costs. Taken together, these results show that the deep decarbonisation of the NEM relies heavily on the ISP's projected technology learning and cost reductions, particularly for wind and solar PV. But the ability of an electricity system to incorporate variable renewable generation depends on many factors and should expand as technologies come and go. However, these limits are not presently clear and are the focus of major research activity around the world. For example, requiring at least 30% synchronous generation at all times and less than 50% variable renewable generation annually in any NEM region results in concentrating solar thermal or coal displacing wind, solar PV, and pumped hydro, depending on the emissions constraint. These results also show that the total cost of increasing the total costs increase when renewable integration is limited. Now, concentrating solar thermal technologies are significantly less mature than wind and solar PV, whilst the capital costs of pumped hydro are strongly site-specific. So this shows the case of 100% abatement with variable renewable limits and no solar thermal in the mix. In this case, we see that some coal plants are retrofitted with carbon capture and storage and are co-fired with biomass. In addition, gas turbines run on natural gas and biomethane blends, visible here in red for natural gas and this brown for biomethane. Here we show the sensitivity of this 100% abatement result to the pumped hydro capital cost. As the pumped hydro capital cost increases, less solar PV and more wind capacity is present in the optimal mix, while the synchronous generation is relatively unchanged. This also shows that the estimated wholesale market cost is highly sensitive to the pumped hydro cost, because in these cases, pumped hydro is required to balance the variable renewable generation. And what about the prospects of nuclear technologies in a decarbonised NEM? Well, they appear to be negligible if the cost of variable renewable generation tracks as projected, and if variable renewable generation can be accommodated without significant limitations. But nuclear could play a significant role if its capital cost is less than about 6,000 Australian dollars per kilowatt of installed capacity, and if variable renewable generation and solar thermal face challenges. Nuclear would then take market share from other synchronous plants. In conclusion, we have found that if projections of technology learning are realised, particularly for wind and solar PV, achieving deep decarbonisation of Australia's national electricity market is plausible for very low additional costs. 100% abatement by 2050 is about 5% more expensive than having no emissions constraint. And 100% abatement by 2040 is about 5% more expensive than the same target by 2050. And in all of these scenarios, pumped hydro energy storage plays a major role in balancing large installed capacities of wind and solar PV. However, if negative emissions from the NEM is sought, or if the integration of variable renewable generation doesn't meet projections, other firm low-carbon options appear to be significant. Concentrating solar thermal then has significant prospects for the 100% abatement scenarios, and innovative combinations of biofuels and carbon capture and storage may play a role in the 100% abatement cases. But biofuels and CCS would then play a greater role for negative emissions, with the resource availability becoming a limit on the abatement potential. Nuclear might play a role if several things fall into place. If the integration of variable renewable generation meets projections, then nuclear doesn't have significant prospects. But if the integration of variable renewable generation and solar thermal don't meet projections, it appears that the nuclear capex needs to be less than approximately 6,000 Australian dollars per kilowatt of installed capacity to have prospects. So thank you very much for your attention.